Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. As you know, this course is an introduction to Latinx studies, and the purpose of this course is to introduce you to the field of study. What kinds of things do we study in the field? What methodologies do we use? What topics do we cover? What are some of the key debates within the field? And one of the big ones is what to name this population. So I wanted to start out with a discussion of all the different ways in which this population has been addressed, the different labels that are used, the history of these labels, and the various debates, as you probably got a glimpse from the reading. So one of the labels that you're probably most familiar with is the term Hispanic. This term was created by the Office of Budget and Management in 1977 for the purposes of the census. One of the big questions has always been what to call this population, how to count them in the census. And so in 1977, the solution became to create this term, Hispanic, and that has been one of the major terms that has been used since then. This term includes people who are here from Spain. They're often perceived as representing the assimilated middle class. It is often used for marketing purposes, and it lumps all Latinx cultures and histories together, essentially erasing their uniqueness. And you see some of that represented in this image of this term Hispanic kind of squishing all of the individual terms that are often used by the population itself. Another term that I'm sure you've heard is Latino, but as you have probably noticed, there are changes to this term that have happened over time. This term is more of a grassroots term created by the population itself. It only includes people who are from Latin America or have ancestry in Latin America, and not people from Spain. This was a way to separate the population from another colonizer, the Spanish Empire. The slash between the O and the A began to be used as a way to include women, where women started to say, well, the O in Latino is masculine and it excludes the unique experiences of women. And then more recently, we've had the addition of the X, which was added as a way to create a gender neutral and inclusive term. The Spanish language, if you're not familiar with it, is a gendered language. A lot of the words change, particularly their endings, depending on whether you're speaking of a female person or a male person. But as our awareness, our social awareness has become more developed in terms of the real complexities of gender and gender identity, the term Latinx has become more popular as a way to acknowledge that the language is gendered and a way to try to incorporate gender neutral and non-binary folks. Latine, the E, some people use instead of the X because the E fits Spanish grammar more easily than the X does. So there's a lot of debate, even among Latinx people, certainly within the field of Latinx studies, you'll find a lot of scholarship around the uses of these different terms, which one should be used when, should it be the E, should it be the X, and so on. And you'll see some of this reflected in many of our readings throughout the semester. The term Chicano itself is another complicated term. Chicano is a politicized term created during the Chicano movement that began during the 1960s. It was created by the youth of the Mexican-American community of that particular time as a way to identify themselves as being different from their parents' generation, but also as a way to create an identity for themselves that reflected their more radical, revolutionary kind of politics of the time, to recognize the fact that they weren't immigrants, that Mexican Americans had been here for a very long time, and therefore had a right to claim the United States, and particularly the Southwest, as their homeland. And so it's a way to recognize that Mexican Americans have a colonized history within the United States dating back to 1848. The O, A, and X have been added over time for gender inclusivity, the same way that we just discussed with the term Latino. However, this term is by no means used by all of the folks in the United States who could fall under the umbrella term of Mexican American. Mexican American itself is often used instead of Chicano, which refers to anyone of Mexican descent born and raised in the United States. Often Mexican is used as well, usually used by immigrants who were born and or raised in Mexico, but often people who are Mexican American who are born in the United States might call themselves Mexicans as well. Tejano refers to a Mexican or a Mexican American from Texas. So you also have regional identities, how people identify their Mexican American identity changes depending on where you are in the country. Another example of this is the term Hispano, which is used in New Mexico by those who are descendants of Mexicans and Spaniards from the colonial era. So these populations have very unique histories in different parts of the United States. And so that history has also influenced what people in those particular parts of the country call themselves, how they decide to identify their particular Mexican American identity. The Latinx term and also the term Hispanic also encompasses a number of other groups outside of the large Mexican American population. There are, of course, Puerto Ricans who are born and or raised in the United States outside of the island. The term Latinx is not used in the island of Puerto Rico, even though people in Puerto Rico are American citizens. We also have populations of Cuban Americans, a population that increased significantly after the 1959 Castro Revolution, a large population of which primarily resides in South Florida. You also have a significant population of people from Central America, which increased significantly after the 1980 civil wars in that region. The largest U.S. population from that region in the United States is from El Salvador. We also have populations from different parts of South America, which includes people from Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and most recently we have seen an uptick in immigrants coming from Venezuela. So in reality, we have people in the United States from every single country in Latin America. It just depends on where they're coming from, depends how long they've been coming to the United States, what kind of relationship they've had with the United States, and their numbers within the United States. Whereas, for instance, we do have people from Costa Rica, for example, which is in Central America, but the population is relatively smaller compared to other larger groups like Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. And those distinctions do have an influence in terms of not only how each of those populations identify themselves in the United States, but also what kind of experience they have in the United States as well. Now, how do the population identifies itself? According to the Pew Research Center report of 2020, only 3% of the population uses the term Latinx. The majority still use the term Hispanic, and most prefer to use national terms to identify themselves, such as Puerto Rican or Mexican American. And as you see in the graph there, a very small percentage have even heard of the term, much less use it. So even of the population who have heard the term, there's still a large number of those who've heard the term who don't use it at all. The report is much bigger than obviously this one graphic here. And in the report, they do talk about gender differences, generational differences. So the folks that seem to use the term Latinx more tend to be more college age and people who have attended college. So college is a main place where you will hear terms using the X like Chicanx and Latinx more frequently, but outside of college environments, you often don't hear this particular term. Older generations beyond the current college age as well, and by college age here, I mean traditional college age, like 18 to 22 years old, they don't really use the term or even familiar with it. So that's something also to keep in mind in terms of, all these terms that have been developed over time to name the population, but also being mindful of, well, what do the people themselves in their everyday lives call themselves? The other term that we talked about within the readings is the term Latinidades, which was one of the articles you had to read. And this term has been used by scholars to explore how Latinxes express their Latinx identity, right? Using as a plural, Latinidades, is a way to recognize that how people experience and identify with their Latinx identities is going to be very different from each other, right? That there isn't really one way in which everybody that falls into this category chooses to identify with this identity. Latinidades is also used to discuss Latinxes who come from mixed Latinx backgrounds, like if you're half Puerto Rican or half Ecuadorian, or as the image here is representing, Mexi-Rican, sort of combining the Puerto Rican and Mexican flags. And there are quite a number of the population of Latinxes who have multiple Latinx identities, right? And so how would those people identify themselves? And so some of those folks having a term like Hispanic or Latinx is useful because it means that they don't have to choose to identify with one parent or the other, for example. Latinidades also recognizes multiple racial Latinx experience, such as talking about things like Afro-Latinidades and indigeneity. Again, another way of recognizing that there are different ways in which Latinx identity is experienced. And we will talk throughout the semester about these various different ways in which Latinx people identify. Now, there are pros and cons that are often debated around the usefulness or not of using an umbrella term like Hispanic or Latinx. Some of the pros are allowing diverse Latinx groups to join together in political movements, addressing issues that impact the majority of the group. For example, immigration policy, right? Immigration policy is something that impacts a lot of variety of the Latinx population, regardless of whether they're Cuban or they're Dominican or Mexican. They all have sort of this one thing in common. And so when it comes to be able to mobilize around this issue, it is useful to have an umbrella term that combines and unifies the whole population. This also is a way to create a sense of community and unity, right? If you live in certain parts of the country where, let's say, they aren't very you're Mexican American, but they're not very a lot of Mexican Americans where you're living, but there are a lot of Cubans, or there are a lot of Puerto Ricans or people from Central America. Being able to call yourself or identify with an umbrella term allows you to create a sense of community and unity with other folks that are somewhat similar to you in your experience. Some of the cons of using an umbrella term that are often debated is that it erases individual group histories and cultures, right? And this was one of the points from the article by Susanna Voller, where she's talking about, in her case, how the term Mexican has become sort of this umbrella term and has replaced the term Hispanic. But the argument is the same in that if you lump all of these people together who have very different cultures and very different histories, that you are erasing the unique aspects of those cultures. It also upholds an assumption that they're all the same. So if you lump all these different populations together, it upholds this idea that you don't have to worry about telling the difference between a Mexican and a Puerto Rican, even though there's a very different history to those two populations in the United States. There's a very different relationship to immigration policy. Puerto Ricans have American citizenship, whether they're on the island or in the United States. There are Mexican immigrants, there are undocumented people from Mexico, for example, for whom immigration and citizenship is a big issue, right? You lump those two groups together and assume that they're all having the same experience, you're making a pretty bad assumption there, right? It also erases longtime American citizenship of Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans because they're all perceived as foreigners, right? And it erases the fact that Mexican Americans have been here for hundreds of years, right? There's some people, particularly where we are in Colorado and New Mexico, that can trace their ancestry back to when those territories were part of Mexico or were even part of Spain, right? They never moved, they never crossed the border. Same thing for Puerto Ricans. And so it continues to uphold this image that Latinos only got here yesterday, and that they're all immigrants, or that they're not citizens, right? And that is not the case for all of this population, right? So those are some of the issues that get raised against using these kinds of umbrella terms to talk about the entire population. Now, this image here is an example of the usefulness of using an umbrella term like Latinos or Latinx, because it makes the population overall clearly more significant. And it allows to be able to make certain arguments about the significance of this population and why it should be paid attention to, right? So in this graphic, for instance, you see 50.5 million people in the United States identify or can be identified as Latino, which is 16.3% of the population. You see 1 in every 6 individuals is Latino, 1 in every 4 children is Latino. 56% of the population growth from 2000 to 2010 happened in this population. And they consist of $1 trillion in buying power. And you see there the breakdown, right? Clearly the largest Latinx population in the United States is Mexican American, followed by Puerto Rican, Salvadorian, and so on. And so this kind of graphic is important to be used when it comes to making arguments as to why businesses, for example, need to pay attention to this population, because they represent $1 trillion worth of buying power, right? And so if you're not paying attention to this population, if you're not trying to figure out how to sell, how to market to this population, then you're missing out, right? Same thing when it comes to politics, right? As this population continues to grow, the fact that 1 in every 4 children is a Latinx child, that's important for a long-term consideration when thinking about what kind of potential impact this population has in terms of elections, right? So this is one example of the usefulness of using this term, using an umbrella term, right? But as I mentioned before in the previous slide, there are also arguments against using an umbrella term. The article from Obolera, as I mentioned earlier, was starting to look at how the term Mexican, particularly as a result of the Trump administration, has become a way to talk about the Latino population in general, right? It generalizes all Latinxes as foreign and illegal because now there's certain things that have been equated with Mexican, right? Mexican, quote unquote, equals illegal, equals a threat to the nation, equals, all sorts of negative connotations that were added to Mexican as a result of the Trump administration. And so because this term has been equated to illegal, all Latinxes, regardless of citizenship, such as Puerto Ricans and long-term Mexican Americans, for example, are subject to being racially profiled. And the reading talked about the one court case where this Puerto Rican driver in the car was saying that his American citizenship rights were being denied because he had been racially profiled. And the court found that the potential illegality of him or the passengers that he had in his car was more important than considering whether he was being racially profiled or not, or whether his American citizenship rights were being denied or not in that particular situation. And so what it really demonstrates, right, when you create a term to signify very flat, stereotypical kinds of images, how they can be used to deny people who have American citizenship their rights as well, right? And so this is part of what she's talking about in that article, is how you can take in this case, Mexican, because they are the larger population, Latinx population, but also because of our ongoing historical, right, connections through the border to Mexico, how it can be generalized to be used with every Latinx population, and ends up having some of the same harmful effects of some other umbrella terms like Hispanic. So the key takeaways from this whole discussion of all these different labels is that the Latinx population is incredibly diverse in their cultures, histories, and experiences in the United States. The terms used to describe this population are flexible and keep changing over time. So one time Hispanic was perfectly fine and everybody used it. And over time it became Latino, and now we have Latinx or Latine. And so well, the thing to take away from this history is that the term isn't fixed, right? And that it changes over time, right? And that more than likely will continue to develop and change, right? But also to consider that how individual Latinxs choose to identify themselves is a personal individual choice. Right? That regardless of what the government puts on the census, regardless of what even we in higher education decide to call our departments and so on, what the people, the individual person themselves chooses to identify with is a personal choice, right? And so often students want to take away, what is the term, right, that they can use because they don't want to offend anyone, right? Innocently use the wrong term and offend someone. And the reality is that there isn't any one term, right? And so the safest thing is to ask someone, what do you prefer that I refer to you as? That is the most safest and most respectful way to address a person's identity, right? And because these terms have changed over time, many of them continue to be used. You'll see me use them interchangeably throughout the semester, and that is just my way of recognizing this complex history, but also the fact that not everybody's going to relate to any one particular term, and that given another 5 years, 10 years, or even tomorrow, there might be another new term that is developing as a better way to identify this population. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit the debates around these different terms for the Latinx population, but it also hopefully helps you understand why you might hear me throughout the semester, and even some of our authors, some of the readings we'll be doing, that they're choosing different varieties of terms when talking about this population. Okay, this ends this lecture for this week. I'll see you guys online. Have a wonderful week.